The 1920s ended with a bang. October 1929 saw Wall Street collapse, taking the American economy with it. Unemployment hit 25%. Banks failed, fortunes vanished overnight. But here's the strange part. Even when people lost everything, they still had something they never had much of before: time. Lots of it. The question was how to fill it when you couldn't afford to do anything. When everything falls apart, people look for escape. During the Great Depression, they found it in the dark. Movie theaters became America's refuge from reality. Ticket prices dropped to match empty pockets, with most theaters charging between 10 and 25 cents for admission. Despite 25% unemployment, somewhere between 60 and 90 million. Americans went to the movies every single week. Hollywood didn't just survive the Depression, it thrived. The 1930s became Hollywood's golden age. Studios churned out musicals, screwball comedies, and glamorous melodramas. Anything to help audiences forget about breadlines, gangster films became wildly popular too, offering a different kind of fantasy where guys with nothing could shoot their way to the top. The desperation showed. In strange ways, social workers documented cases of families skipping meals to afford movie tickets. They'd choose fantasy over food. For 90 minutes, you could sit in an air-conditioned theater watching dancers in evening wear glide across gleaming floors. Then the lights came up and you walked back out into a country where 1 in 4 people couldn't find work. But movies weren't the only escape available to Depression-era Americans. If you couldn't afford a movie ticket, there was always the radio. By the early 1930s, most American homes had one. They'd bought them during the prosperous 20s. And now that investment paid dividends. Radio became the lifeline connecting isolated families to the outside world. Better yet, once you owned the box, the entertainment was free. Well, almost free. You still needed electricity, and plenty of families lost even that. Radio programming exploded during the Depression. Soap operas got their name because soap companies sponsored the daytime dramas that kept housewives tuning in. Comedy shows drew massive audiences. Mystery programs and westerns created appointment listening, with families gathering around the radio the way they'd later gather around television sets. Each episode ended on a cliffhanger, guaranteeing you'd tune in next week. President Franklin Roosevelt understood radio's power. His fireside chats became national events. Millions of Americans would sit in their living rooms and listen to their president speak directly to them about the economic crisis. It created a sense of shared experience, a feeling that everyone was in this together. Radio also taught advertisers something valuable. You could sell products to broke people if you did it right. Sponsors learned to pitch affordable luxuries and payment plans, selling the idea that better days were coming. Of course, radio wasn't the only cheap entertainment people turned to. Libraries saw something unexpected during the Depression. Applications for library cards surged. People who'd never set foot in a library suddenly became regulars. Reading was free, and it offered everything desperate people needed: escape from reality, education to find new work, information about available jobs, a warm place to sit when you couldn't afford to heat your home. Librarians reported packed reading rooms filled with unemployed men, scanning help-wanted ads and studying technical manuals, hoping to learn new skills. Others devoured novels, letting fiction transport them away from their circumstances. Libraries became community centers by default, serving people who had nowhere else to go, but not everyone could get to a library. That's where pulp magazines came in. For a dime, you could buy a magazine packed with stories. Westerns, detective tales, science fiction, romance. The content was disposable, printed on cheap paper that gave the genre its name, but the stories were addictive. Pulp magazines sold millions of copies throughout the 1930s. Comic books emerged too, offering heroes and fantasy worlds that cost almost nothing. Intellectual stimulation and entertainment available for pennies, while college-educated professionals stood in bread lines, but not everyone turned to books and magazines. Some looked for escape closer to home. In 1935, a game about getting rich hit American stores. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. Monopoly let players buy properties, build hotels, and bankrupt their opponents, everything real Americans couldn't do anymore. The game became an instant phenomenon. Monopoly became the best-selling game in America within a year. Families who couldn't afford rent in real life spent hours pretending to own Boardwalk and Park Place. The fantasy of wealth appealed to people who had none. Board games in general saw a massive surge during the Depression. They made perfect sense for the times. You bought them once and could play them hundreds of times. Just reusable entertainment that could fill an entire evening. The home became America's entertainment center by necessity, not choice. Going out cost money. Staying in didn't. Hosting friends for a game night meant everyone could socialize without spending anything. You could maintain relationships without having to admit you were broke. Of course, your friends were probably broke too, so nobody was fooling anybody. But some people couldn't even afford to stay home all the time. They needed to get out to feel normal, even if they couldn't buy anything. Looking without buying became an accepted pastime during the Depression. People would dress in their best clothes and go downtown just to look at things in store windows. Not to purchase, just to look. Department stores encouraged it because they understood something important. Today's window shopper might be tomorrow's customer when the economy recovers. There was dignity in browsing. You could walk through nice stores, look at quality goods, and maintain the appearance of a normal shopping trip. The humiliation came in the gap between wanting and affording, between looking and leaving empty-handed. The contrast with the 1920s was stark. Just a few years earlier, Americans had embraced consumer culture with abandon. Now those same stores welcome people who had no intention of purchasing anything. Window shopping cost nothing but shoe leather. More than 250,000 people rode the rails during the Depression. Most were young men, but women and even families joined them. They hopped freight trains illegally, moving from town to town looking for work, food, or just something different from the desperation they'd left behind. This wasn't exactly leisure, but it became a culture unto itself. Hobo jungles sprang up near rail yards across the country. These temporary camps became communities where transients shared food, told stories, and helped each other survive. They developed their own language, marking buildings and fences with symbols that told other hobos where to find a friendly meal or which towns to avoid. The camps had rules and hierarchies. Structure existed even in the chaos. There was adventure mixed with the desperation. Young men who'd never left their hometowns suddenly found themselves traveling across America. They saw the country in ways their parents never had. For some, riding the rails meant freedom from failed responsibilities and disappointed families, but the reality was harsher than the romance. Train hopping was dangerous. People died falling from cars or getting crushed between them. Railroad police beat transients and threw them in jail. Towns often treated hobos like criminals. The truth was more complicated than the folklore. These were desperate people doing what they had to do, sometimes finding community in shared hardship. Not everyone left town looking for work, though. Some stayed home and found different ways to fill their time. Professional sports took a hit during the Depression. Attendance at Major League Baseball games dropped as people couldn't afford tickets. Boxing matches drew smaller crowds. But here's what didn't decline: people actually playing sports. Amateur athletics exploded. Sandlot baseball became ubiquitous. Every neighborhood had pickup games. Empty lots turned into makeshift ball fields. Kids and adults played together because everyone had time and nobody had money. Street games multiplied. Stickball, basketball on makeshift hoops, touch football in parks. Any game that required minimal equipment and no admission fee became popular, church leagues and company leagues kept operating throughout the Depression. Companies that managed to stay in business often sponsored teams for their workers. Churches organized leagues that brought communities together. These weren't just games. They were social structures that helped people maintain connections when everything else was falling apart. People borrowed equipment or made it from whatever they could find. Gloves got passed around. Baseballs got taped up and used until they literally fell apart. Nobody cared that the gear was worn or makeshift. Sports offered something crucial during the Depression: dignity. A man who couldn't find work could still hit a home run. A kid whose family lost everything could still be the best pitcher in the neighborhood. Competition didn't care about your bank account, but not everyone looked for dignity in healthy competition. Some looked for salvation in schemes. Desperation makes people believe in magic. During the Depression, that magic took the form of chain letters. The concept was simple and seductive. You'd receive a letter with a list of names, send a dime to the person at the top, add your name to the bottom, and mail copies to 5 friends. When your name reached the top, you'd supposedly receive thousands of dimes from strangers. Easy money, no work required, just faith in the system. Chain letters swept through America in waves during the mid-1930s. The post office became overwhelmed as millions of people participated in what was essentially an early pyramid scheme. People who couldn't afford groceries somehow found money to mail letters because they believed this might be their ticket out of poverty. It wasn't, of course, the mathematics never worked, but the schemes kept reappearing in different forms because broke people wanted to believe in simple solutions to complex problems. When you've lost everything and can't find work, the idea that 10 cents could transform into hundreds of dollars becomes irresistible. Authorities eventually cracked down states, and the federal government outlawed chain letters and similar schemes. The schemes represented false hope as entertainment, desperation masquerading as opportunity. They showed how far people would go when traditional paths to prosperity had collapsed. At least with a chain letter, you were doing something, even if that something was just sending your last dime to a stranger. But not all escapes during the Depression required magical thinking. Some came in liquid form. December 5th, 1933, brought good news for a change. The 21st Amendment officially ended Prohibition. Speakeasies transformed overnight into legitimate bars and taverns. But the clientele had changed dramatically since the glamorous bootlegging days of the 1920s. Depression-era bars bore no resemblance to the secret clubs that had defined the previous decade. The glitz vanished. Gone were the jazz bands, the well-dressed crowds, and the thrill of breaking the law. What replaced them were sawdust floors, nickel beer nights, and rooms full of unemployed men nursing drinks they could barely afford. Bars became de facto community centers for men who had nowhere else to go. When you couldn't find work and couldn't bear to go home and face your family again, you could sit in a bar for a few hours. A nickel bought you a beer and a place to exist. You could talk to other men in the same situation, share rumors about job openings, or just sit quietly with your thoughts. The same activity that had been rebellious and exciting in the 20s now carried the weight of desperation. People weren't drinking to party anymore. They were drinking to cope, to forget, or just to fill time that hung heavy when there was no work to do. But the government did more than just legalize drinking. It actually tried to provide free entertainment to lift people's spirits. In 1935, President Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, and part of its mission was unexpected. The WPA didn't just build roads and bridges. It employed artists, actors, musicians, and writers. The Federal Theater Project, Federal Art Project, and Federal Music Project put thousands of creative people to work creating entertainment for Americans who couldn't afford to pay for it. WPA theater companies performed in parks, schools, and town squares across America. They staged everything from Shakespeare to original plays about contemporary issues. Admission was free or nearly free. Musicians gave free concerts. Artists painted murals in post offices and public buildings. Puppeteers traveled to small towns with shows for children. The government was subsidizing entertainment on a massive scale, and the goal was as much about morale as employment. The programs faced criticism. Some called it wasteful government spending. Others objected to the political content of certain plays and artworks. But for millions of Americans, WPA performances were the only culture they encountered during the Depression. The WPA arts programs represented something unusual. The government acknowledged that people needed more than jobs and food. They needed beauty, stories, music, and distraction. They needed to feel human even when circumstances tried to strip that away. Of course, all of these activities, from movies to government theater, pointed to the same truth about Depression-era America. The Great Depression created a strange paradox. Americans had more free time than ever before because they couldn't find work, but less money than ever to spend on it. The result split down the middle. Some industries thrived, turning desperation into profit by offering cheap escape. Other activities revealed the darker truth, born not from leisure, but from survival instincts and false hope. Through it all, people adapted. They didn't surrender to despair, even when surrender would have been understandable. Instead, they found ways to hold on to joy, community, and dignity in whatever forms they could afford. Sometimes that meant fantasy and entertainment. Sometimes it meant desperation disguised as recreation. The line between the two was thinner than anyone wanted to admit.